In a quiet suburban neighborhood, where life usually moves at a gentle, predictable pace, a nightmare was quietly brewing behind closed doors. What began as a story of love, trust, and shared dreams would descend into a chilling tale of betrayal and fury, ultimately shattering the lives of everyone involved. Our story revolves around Lara Reynolds, known to her friends as Lara, a woman who built her life around her family and marriage. To the outside world, Lara seemed the perfect wife and mother, devoted and unwavering, the kind of woman who gave everything to those she loved. Beside her stood Adam, a respected attorney, successful, ambitious, and admired by many in their small Texas community. Together they created an enviable life, built on years of shared effort, sacrifice, and what seemed to be a deep and lasting bond. But beneath the surface, a silent storm was brewing. The years of loyalty and support she had poured into her marriage were suddenly met with a harsh and devastating betrayal. Adam, the man she trusted above all else, had strayed. His loyalty had shifted to someone younger, someone fresh and intriguing, a woman who, in Lara's eyes, represented everything she was no longer. Adam's affair with his receptionist, a fact she could barely bring herself to believe, was a crack in the foundation of her life, and that crack was spreading fast. The betrayal left Lara reeling, her heartbreak twisted into something darker, a festering resentment, a rage that simmered beneath the surface. To Lara, this was more than an affair. It was the theft of a life she had given everything to build, a rejection that cut her to the core. Day after day, the hurt sank deeper, turning her once devoted love into an obsession she couldn't escape. With every passing moment, Lara's anger grew, consuming her thoughts, her focus, her every waking moment. And as her love twisted into bitterness, it became clear that she could not let go. She couldn't walk away, not after all she had sacrificed. She wanted answers. She wanted justice. And in the end, she wanted revenge. In this story, we'll follow the relentless path that Lara Reynolds carved for herself. A journey from heartbreak to vengeance, driven by a rage so fierce it would not rest until it saw destruction. This is the tale of a woman scorned, a love turned lethal, and a betrayal that would stain the quiet streets of a peaceful town with an unforgettable horror. Lara Reynolds was a woman who seemed to have it all. She had built a successful career as a dentist, rising through the ranks with determination and an unwavering commitment to her craft. Patients respected her, colleagues admired her, and those close to her saw her as a steady, dependable figure, someone who balanced her professional ambitions with an equally deep devotion to her family. For Lara, success was never just about prestige or recognition. It was about creating a life filled with purpose and pride, a life built on loyalty and love. But Lara's dedication extended beyond her career. At home, she was known as a devoted wife and a loving mother. She and her husband Adam had what appeared to be a storybook marriage, the kind people admired from afar. Together, they had built a comfortable life, a picture of suburban happiness that friends and family envied. Lara had stood by Adam through the long hours and late nights, supporting his ambitions as she juggled her own. She believed in him, in their partnership, and in the future they were building together. Every sacrifice she made, every extra hour she spent making sure the family was whole, was an investment in their shared dreams. Yet, as time went on, something began to change. At first, the signs were subtle. Adam would come home a little later each evening, his explanations growing vaguer. He became distant, distracted, and less present in the home they had built together. The laughter and easy conversations that had once filled their house began to fade, replaced by Adam's silences and Lara's growing unease. It was as if there was a shadow that neither could see, but both could feel, creeping into the heart of their marriage. Lara tried to ignore the feeling, to push away the doubts that gnawed at her. She told herself it was just the stress of their busy lives, a rough patch that they would soon work through. But no amount of reassurance could quiet the growing suspicion that something was wrong. Adam's gaze would linger a little too long on his phone. A new cologne would catch her attention, and excuses about late meetings became harder and harder to believe. One evening, when the unease became too much to bear, Lara followed her instincts. She searched for the clues she feared might be there, hoping that she would find nothing. But the truth lay waiting, cold and undeniable. There, buried in Adam's messages, were the signs of betrayal. Her husband, the man she had sacrificed so much for, was having an affair, not just with anyone, but with Emily, his young, charming receptionist. The discovery left Lara breathless. The walls of the life she thought she knew seemed to close in around her, each memory now tainted by a lie. She could hardly believe it. The man she had built her world around had deceived her, replaced her loyalty with a fleeting romance. The disbelief cut deep, searing her with a pain she couldn't escape. In the days that followed, Lara's sorrow was all-consuming. She withdrew from the world, her thoughts trapped in an endless loop of betrayal and loss. But as the initial shock began to fade, her grief morphed into something else. It became anger, a simmering fury that filled the void left by the love she had once felt. It was as if the betrayal had lit a fire inside her, a relentless heat that only grew with each reminder of what Adam had done. Lara couldn't shake the images that haunted her, of Adam with Emily, of the smiles they shared, the quiet, stolen moments that should have been hers alone. Her thoughts darkened, her sense of betrayal twisting into a need for confrontation. She needed to face Adam, to make him understand the devastation he had wrought upon their lives. The idea of simply walking away felt impossible. She couldn't let him move on so easily, not while her world lay in ruins. As the days passed, Lara's desire for closure became an obsession. She found herself consumed by the thought of confronting him, of demanding answers. Her once orderly life became a tangled web of anger and hurt, a chaos she could not control. Her love for Adam, once steadfast and unwavering, had turned to bitterness. And as she fixated on his betrayal, it was clear that this confrontation, this reckoning, was something she could no longer resist. After the discovery of Adam's betrayal, Lara's world became a blur of unrelenting pain and anger. What once brought her peace, her work, her family, her life's purpose, now felt hollow, like pieces of a shattered illusion. Her mind spiraled in an endless loop of questions and agonizing images. Every glance in the mirror was a reminder of the life she'd sacrificed for him, a life that he had so effortlessly dismantled. The pain of his deceit became something darker, festering in the silence of her thoughts, poisoning every memory of what they had once shared. As days turned into weeks, Lara found herself haunted by the whispers of their affair, the intimate moments they must have shared, the secrets they must have kept. It gnawed at her, a brutal reminder of how easily Adam had discarded their life. The humiliation burned within her, knowing that while she had stood by his side, Adam had cast her aside for someone who was, in her eyes, a fleeting distraction. Lara's hurt twisted into something sharper. She couldn't let go. The idea of confronting Adam became her obsession. She needed to understand why, to make him see the wreckage he'd left behind. But more than that, she needed control, to reclaim the power he had taken from her. The need to confront him, to expose his lies, became the only thing she could focus on. And so, she made a decision. Unable to trust his word, she hired a private investigator. someone to confirm what she already knew, but needed to see with her own eyes. Day by day, the investigator delivered pieces of her husband's double life. Places he'd been with Emily, times he'd left work early to meet her, phone records filled with calls and messages. Each detail was a stab to Lara's heart, solidifying the betrayal that she could no longer deny. As the evidence piled up, so did her anger, layering itself over every wound until she was numb to everything but her fury. It was on an unremarkable morning when Lara received the news she'd been waiting for, though she could hardly prepare herself for what it would spark. Adam was meeting Emily at a hotel, a place just far enough from their home that he could hide without worry. The message was clear, direct, and there was no mistaking the implication. That single text from the investigator seemed to ignite something in Lara. She felt a rush of adrenaline, a clarity that swept through her, filling her with a singular purpose. Lara's movements that day were almost automatic, driven by a need she could no longer control. She dressed without a second thought, her expression set, her hands steady, as she prepared to confront Adam. The plan was simple. She would face him, demand the answers she'd been denied, make him see the cost of his betrayal. But as she gripped the wheel, driving towards the hotel, she felt the anger simmering, building with every mile. The scenes replayed in her mind as she approached the hotel. She pictured Adam and Emily together, laughing, sharing the moments he once promised to her alone. Her hands clenched the steering wheel, knuckles white as she parked and scanned the building's facade, her pulse quickening. The humiliation, the heartbreak, they had all led her to this moment, this confrontation. She would not be ignored, not after everything she had sacrificed. And as she stepped out of the car, her emotions at a breaking point, one thing was clear. Lara Reynolds was not the woman she once was. This was no longer about love. It was about justice, her own twisted form of it. Lara entered the hotel lobby, her movements deliberate, her face set in stone. She knew where they were, and with every step, her fury only grew, each heartbeat propelling her forward. Her eyes scanned the room until they fell upon them. Adam and Emily, seated close, their heads tilted together in quiet laughter. In that instant, the last threads of restraint snapped. Lara's approach was swift, her footsteps echoing across the polished floor as she came face to face with the betrayal that had haunted her. Her voice cut through the lobby like a blade, her accusations sharp, fierce. People turned to watch as her words filled the room, every syllable laced with the hurt and anger she'd been holding back for so long. Adam, caught off guard, stumbled over his words, his face pale as he registered Lara's fury. But his shock only fueled her. Every denial, every excuse he muttered seemed to deepen her rage. She saw the fear in his eyes, saw Emily's discomfort as she shifted in her seat, trying to shrink away from the confrontation. The scene was chaotic, tense, the entire room holding its breath as Lara unleashed the torrent of emotions that had festered for weeks. Finally, Lara stepped back, her chest heaving, her eyes locked on Adam's, and a calm, eerie silence fell between them. She turned on her heel and walked out, but her steps were not those of a woman retreating. They were the measured, purposeful strides of someone who had only just begun. Outside, the air felt heavy, pressing down on her as she reached her car. Her hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, the world around her narrowing to a single, fiery focus. The pain of betrayal, the humiliation she'd endured surged through her veins, feeding her anger until it overflowed. Her gaze was cold, unyielding, fixed on Adam, who was now making his way out of the hotel, clearly shaken. Without a second thought, without any hesitation, Lara's foot pressed down on the accelerator. In that moment, There was nothing else, just the sound of the engine roaring to life, the feel of the steering wheel beneath her hands, and the sight of Adam in her path. The impact was sudden, brutal, a sickening thud that silenced the murmur of onlookers. But it wasn't enough. In the haze of her fury, she reversed, her mind clouded by a need for retribution that blinded her to everything else. She saw Adam struggling to get up, and with a cold, detached resolve, she hit the accelerator once more. Another sickening thud, another jolt that shook the car, yet in her mind it felt justified, as though each act of violence could somehow repair the wounds he had inflicted. Around her, chaos erupted. Onlookers screamed, rushing to pull back, some frantically dialing for help, others too stunned to move. She could hear the distant wail of sirens, growing louder, closing in, but she felt strangely calm. As the last embers of her rage flickered, she loosened her grip on the wheel, feeling an emptiness settle where her fury had burned. When the police arrived, the scene was a blur of flashing lights and horrified faces. Officers moved quickly, surrounding her, but Lara didn't resist. Her face was expressionless, her mind quiet, as they handcuffed her and led her away. She barely registered the whispers, the gasps of onlookers, or the chilling realization that her life would never be the same. In her heart, she knew she had crossed a line from which there was no return. And as the doors of the squad car closed behind her, she stared out at the scene she had created. A final act of betrayal, a confrontation that had stripped away everything she once was, leaving behind only the haunting silence of her shattered life. The scene outside the hotel was marked by an eerie stillness, broken only by the flashing red and blue lights that bathed the area in a grim glow. Officers moved through the parking lot, their faces tense, voices low as they gathered the evidence left in the wake of Lara's explosive act. In every corner, the aftermath of her rage lingered. Skid marks etched into the pavement, shattered glass scattered across the ground, the unmistakable imprint of a night that would not soon be forgotten. As the police combed through the scene, they meticulously documented each detail. They gathered witness statements from bystanders who had watched, horrified, as Lara's car had surged forward with deadly precision. Each witness had their own version of the events, but they all shared a common thread: the disbelief, the sheer shock of seeing a woman driven to such brutal extremes. Above the lot, security cameras had captured it all. From the moment Lara stormed into the hotel, her anger clear, to the terrifying minutes in which she transformed her vehicle into a weapon of rage. The footage would become central to the investigation, a stark visual record of a love turned lethal, of a betrayal that had pushed her beyond any boundary she might have once known. Each second of that tape would be played back and analyzed, every frame a piece of the puzzle that would soon lay bare the depths of her pain. But it wasn't just law enforcement that would dissect the events of that night. Within hours, word of the crime had spread, igniting a media frenzy that would soon spiral far beyond the quiet streets of their suburban town. Reporters descended upon the scene, cameras flashing, pens scribbling, eager to capture the details of the woman who had taken vengeance into her own hands. Headlines screamed of "a woman scorned," a crime of passion in broad daylight, transforming Lara from a grieving wife into a symbol, an embodiment of love's darkest extremes. The public devoured each new development with morbid fascination, latching onto the tragic irony of a successful, respected woman, brought low by the same emotions she'd once held dear. Opinion columns, talk shows, and radio segments buzzed with speculation and debate. Some people were quick to condemn her, branding her as a cold-blooded killer, someone who had crossed a line that could never be erased. To them, Lara's actions were calculated, premeditated, her fury an excuse for a brutal, deliberate murder. Yet others felt sympathy, even empathy for her, They saw a woman betrayed, humiliated, whose life had unraveled in the face of the ultimate deception. To them, she was a tragic figure, someone who had been pushed beyond her limits, who had acted not out of malice, but out of unbearable pain. As the story unfolded, Lara became a polarizing figure. To some, a victim of her own heartbreak. To others, a killer who had surrendered to the darkest parts of herself. Meanwhile, within the sterile walls of the police station, Lara sat quietly, her gaze distant, her expression unreadable as officers took her initial statement. There was no sobbing, no plea for mercy, only the calm, detached demeanor of someone who had already accepted the gravity of her actions. She answered questions with a steady voice, each word a chilling testament to the transformation she had undergone. When pressed on her reasons, Lara offered no elaborate defense, no excuses. She simply spoke of a moment of uncontrollable rage, a wave of fury that had overtaken her, blinding her to anything beyond her need for retribution. "He destroyed everything," she told them, her voice flat, emotionless. "I did what I had to do." To those around her, it was a chilling statement, a glimpse into a mind that had been pushed to the edge, a heart that had hardened past the point of return. As the days passed, Lara's face became a fixture in the media, her story a subject of endless debate. Some saw her as a tragic heroine, others as a villain, each person bringing their own interpretation to the narrative unfolding before them. For some, she was a woman scorned, a cautionary tale about the price of betrayal and the power of anger. For others, she was a reminder of the darkness that can hide beneath even the most composed exterior, a symbol of love twisted beyond recognition. Lara Reynolds had become more than just a name in a police report. She was a story, a warning, a figure whose life would be dissected, debated, and ultimately judged by a public eager for answers to questions that had none. The trial of Lara Reynolds was a spectacle that captivated the nation. From the first day in court, the atmosphere was charged, heavy with tension, as the story of love turned deadly, played out before an audience eager for every tragic detail. The courtroom was filled with friends, family, reporters, and members of the public who had followed the story from its shocking beginning. Each day they watched as the carefully constructed image of Lara Reynolds, the respected dentist, devoted wife, and mother, was dismantled piece by piece, exposing the darkness that had led her to this point. The prosecution wasted no time painting Lara as a woman who had acted not in a moment of blind rage, but with deliberate, calculated intent. They described how, from the moment she had left the hotel lobby and stormed toward her car, her mind had been set on one purpose. They replayed the harrowing security footage for the jury, each second highlighting the chilling precision with which she had carried out the attack. The prosecutor pointed to the fact that Lara had struck Adam not once, but multiple times, her fury manifesting in each crushing impact as she drove over him, reversed, and accelerated again. For the prosecution, these were not the actions of a woman who had lost control. They were the choices of someone fully aware of the destruction she was causing. Witnesses from that fateful night took the stand, their testimonies casting a pall over the courtroom. A hotel guest described the horror of watching as Lara's car surged forward, seeing the raw, unfiltered rage in her expression as she turned her vehicle into a weapon. Others described the shock of realizing that what they were witnessing was not an accident, but a deliberate act of violence, a scene so terrifying that it had etched itself into their minds, impossible to forget. But perhaps the most painful testimonies came from those who had known Lara best. Family members spoke of a woman who had once been gentle, kind-hearted, someone who had dedicated herself to her family and her career with a selflessness that was impossible to ignore. Friends, visibly shaken, recounted how they had seen her struggle with Adam's betrayal, how they had witnessed her gradual decline as she grappled with the devastation of his affair. But even they could not reconcile the woman they had known with the one who now sat before them, unflinching as her actions were laid bare. Psychologists and mental health experts were called to provide insight into Lara's state of mind. They described the toll that betrayal can take on a person, especially on someone who had invested so much of her identity into her marriage. Some argued that Lara had been pushed to a breaking point, that her love for Adam had transformed into a consuming anger, a rage that had taken root and grown until it had erupted with deadly force. They spoke of temporary insanity, a condition brought on by intense emotional trauma, suggesting that in the moments leading up to the attack, Lara's mind had fractured, her judgment clouded by the overwhelming pain of her husband's infidelity. In a desperate bid to save her, Lara's defense team argued that she was not a cold-blooded killer, but a victim of unimaginable emotional turmoil. They painted her as a woman betrayed, humiliated, and left to navigate the ruins of a life she had built around a man who had cast her aside. They spoke of her years of sacrifice, her unwavering support for Adam, the way she had molded herself around his ambitions, only to be discarded for someone younger, someone new. The defense argued that her actions had not been born of malice but of heartbreak, a temporary break from reality fueled by years of pent-up resentment and anguish. But the prosecution remained firm. They argued that, regardless of the pain she had endured, Lara had made a choice. They presented evidence that she had ample time to reconsider her actions as she approached her car, a moment where she could have walked away. They reminded the jury of the multiple times she had struck Adam, each one a clear, deliberate act, each one proof that this was not an accident or a momentary lapse. It was murder. They asserted that while Lara may have felt hurt, betrayed, her pain did not justify taking a life. Her choice to confront her husband at that hotel and her decision to use her vehicle as a weapon were acts that required intent, not impulse. As the trial neared its end, the weight of each argument, each testimony, hung heavy in the courtroom. The faces of the jury reflected the internal struggle, the difficult task of untangling the truth from the emotion, of seeing past the tragedy to the reality of what had transpired. Lara sat quietly through it all, her expression calm, her eyes focused, as if she had already resigned herself to whatever verdict awaited her. The courtroom was silent as the final arguments were made. The defense pleaded for understanding, for compassion, asking the jury to see Lara not as a monster, but as a woman undone by betrayal, pushed beyond her limits. They urged the jury to consider her not only as a defendant, but as a human being, one who had suffered deeply, one who had simply broken under the weight of her sorrow. The prosecution, however, delivered their final blow with a chilling simplicity. They reminded the jury that two things were certain, that Adam Hughes was dead and that his wife had been the one to kill him. Pain and heartbreak, they argued, did not absolve her of that fact. They implored the jury to see her actions for what they were, the deliberate choices of a woman who had decided that if she couldn't have the life she had built, then no one would. As the courtroom fell into silence, the jury retired to deliberate. All that was left was the waiting, each person haunted by the tragic tale that had unfolded, and the question that lingered in everyone's mind. Was Lara Reynolds a victim, or was she something much darker? The day of the verdict arrived, casting a solemn mood over the packed courtroom. Every seat was filled with friends, family members, reporters, and spectators leaning forward, holding their breath as the jury filed in, their faces somber, their eyes downcast. The silence was thick, stretching across the room as the judge asked the jury foreperson to deliver their decision. a decision that would determine the rest of Lara Reynolds' life. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree. A collective gasp filled the courtroom, followed by a murmur that rippled through the rows. The weight of the verdict settled heavily on everyone present, as though a veil of finality had been drawn over the entire proceedings. For Adam's family, the decision brought a grim sense of closure, a bitter victory that could never truly heal the loss they had suffered. Tears streamed down his mother's face as she clutched a family member's hand, her gaze fixed on Lara, a mixture of sorrow and anger flickering in her eyes. Adam's friends and siblings exchanged glances, their expressions a blend of relief and unresolved grief, knowing that while justice had been served, it would never bring him back. On the opposite side of the room, Lara's family sat in stunned silence, grappling with the reality that the woman they had once known, a devoted wife, a successful professional, had now been branded a murderer. Her parents looked stricken, their faces pale, as they struggled to reconcile the daughter they had loved with the crime she had committed. Friends who had once admired her dedication and kindness now avoided her gaze, torn between the loyalty they had felt and the undeniable horror of her actions. But as the reactions swirled around her, Lara herself sat motionless, her face an unreadable mask, her expression calm, almost detached. There was no trace of regret, no sign of the weight of her sentence pressing down on her. Her eyes were fixed straight ahead, unblinking, as though she had already resigned herself to this outcome long before the jury's decision had been uttered. It was as if the verdict meant nothing to her, as if in her mind her actions had been justified, a necessary response to the betrayal she had suffered. The judge's voice broke the silence, steady but stern, condemning her actions with a severity that echoed through the room. He spoke of the brutality of her crime, of the public nature of her act, a calculated execution fueled by jealousy, hurt, and anger. "You chose not to walk away," he said, his gaze unwavering. "You chose instead to turn your pain into violence, to strip another human being of his life in an act as public as it was ruthless. Your actions were driven not by desperation, but by a need for control, a desire to make him pay for moving on." As he delivered the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole, the weight of his words settled over the room, sealing Lara's fate with a finality that left no room for redemption. For the judge, for the jury, and for everyone who had borne witness to her story, Lara Reynolds had crossed a line from which there was no return. Her love, her loyalty, her anger had all culminated in a single irrevocable act that had destroyed not only her husband's life but her own. Yet through it all, Lara remained impassive, her face devoid of emotion, her gaze steady. To those who looked at her, there was a chilling absence of remorse, a void where regret should have been. It was as though she had surrendered herself to her own narrative, convinced that her actions were justified, that the man she had once loved had simply paid the price for his betrayal. As the gavel struck, sealing her fate, the courtroom emptied slowly, leaving behind the echoes of a tragedy that had unfolded in front of the world. The families departed, burdened by their own grief, each step a reminder of the lives forever changed by Lara's rage. And as she was led away, her expression unchanging, the last image of Lara Reynolds was that of a woman who had looked heartbreak in the face and answered it with vengeance, leaving only ruin in her wake. The fallout from Lara's actions left a lasting scar on everyone touched by her story. For Adam's family, the aftermath of the trial brought no relief, only a hollow sense of justice. His parents, once hopeful for their son's future, were left to mourn not only his death but the life he would never live, the family he would never have. Friends who had grown up with Adam, who had shared in his successes and his struggles, now gathered not to celebrate his life, but to piece together memories, searching for a way to make sense of a life cut short. His siblings, once close to Lara, now struggled with a mixture of anger and disbelief, questioning how someone they had trusted could have committed such a brutal act. On the other side, Lara's family grappled with a different kind of grief, the loss of the woman they once knew. Her parents, who had watched her rise to success, were left reeling, torn between sympathy for their daughter and horror at the crime she had committed. Friends who had admired her kindness and dedication were divided. Some felt she had been driven to the edge, that her actions were the tragic result of a life unhinged by betrayal, while others could not forgive her, unable to reconcile her actions with the woman they thought they knew. Among the public, the case sparked a firestorm of debate. News anchors, talk show hosts, and social media users weighed in, each voice offering a different perspective on Lara's descent into violence. To some, she was a cautionary tale, a woman driven mad by betrayal, a tragic figure who had surrendered everything to a love that had ultimately destroyed her. Commentators and journalists dissected every detail of her life, analyzing her decisions, her relationships, each new revelation adding fuel to a narrative that captivated the nation. Some argued that her act was one of pure passion, a crime that stemmed from a momentary lapse, while others saw it as a calculated act of revenge, the ultimate act of control from a woman who could not accept being left behind. Psychologists and behavioral experts were called in to provide their insights, each one offering a different theory on what had driven Lara to commit such a violent act. Some saw her as a victim of intense emotional strain, someone who had invested so much of herself into her marriage that her sense of identity had become inextricably linked to her role as Adam's wife. They argued that Adam's betrayal had shattered the foundation of her life, leaving her with a sense of loss so profound that it had driven her to desperation, her judgment clouded by overwhelming grief and anger. In their view, Lara's crime was not one of premeditated malice, but of a mind unbalanced by heartbreak, a momentary collapse fueled by a mix of love and rage. Others, however, took a more critical stance. They pointed to the cold, calculated nature of her actions, the way she had approached Adam in her car not once, but repeatedly. To them, her crime was not a lapse, but a deliberate choice, an act of vengeance carried out with chilling precision. They spoke of the psychology of possession, suggesting that Lara's attachment to Adam was less about love and more about control. When he chose to leave her, they argued, she felt as though she had lost not just a husband, but a part of herself, a piece she could not bear to see in the hands of another. Her actions, in their view, were not born of desperation, but of a deep-seated need to reclaim what she believed was hers. Alternative theories circulated among the public, each one adding a new layer to the already complex narrative. Some speculated that Lara had harbored violent intentions long before that night, that her confrontation at the hotel was the result of a plan she had been building, waiting for the right moment to strike. They pointed to her calm demeanor in court, her lack of visible remorse, as evidence of a mind that had been set on revenge all along. Others argued that Lara had simply been a heartbroken wife, pushed past her limits by the weight of betrayal, that her actions were the tragic outcome of a woman who had invested everything into a marriage that had ultimately betrayed her. The fascination with Lara's story persisted long after the courtroom had emptied, the public's interest driven by an unrelenting need to understand the dark, hidden motives that could drive someone to commit such an act. For many, her story served as a stark reminder of how love, when twisted by jealousy and loss, could become a weapon as deadly as any blade. Her crime became a symbol, a warning of the thin line between devotion and obsession, a tale that lingered in the public consciousness as a haunting reflection of what can happen when a heart, once filled with love, is consumed by vengeance. And as the years passed, the name Lara Reynolds became synonymous with betrayal and retribution, her story a permanent fixture in the annals of true crime, a tragic lesson in the depths of human emotion. The aftermath of her actions left everyone touched by her story, struggling to find their own answers, each one haunted by the question that would linger long after her trial. Was she a victim of love gone wrong, or was she something far darker? A woman whose need for control had ultimately led her to destroy the very life she had once cherished.